I do think that I draw from, well, lots of traditions and lots of sorts of other forms, other art forms. So sometimes that's literal. Like obviously there's a long tradition of the poet's relationship to Orpheus even, and mythology, but also something as current and recent as, hip hop. So I tend to think that the poems are reaching from a wide variety of music genres, but there are figures who interest me. And so, Tupac Shakur would be someone who interests me in that way. But again, this would be a poem where maybe you would know that who the ghost of Tupac Shakur is being addressed, but it's not central to the poem. There are also things, I guess, about form that interest me, so that in the last poem, in Cocktails with Orpheus, there's a weird sort of rhyme scheme that's subdued in the poem. And that would be true for this poem, Shakur, which is broken into couplets. And there's weird things like rhyming out and out, or infinite and white, or quiet and stupid, things that you wouldn't necessarily hear, but are just things that, for me, make it just a little bit more interesting. So this is Shakur. I'm coming at you live from the halfway out, where the winter morning stretches out like a white sheet over lovers the infinite has fetched. The still and bone blue white couple found parked, frozen on the highway. I'm thinking of them and the drug that made them think they were warm enough to chill, because I know staying alive requires pills and a wicked streak. I'd need a head cocooned in bass. I need to be locked in a womb to hear your dopey two-note medley, your song pimped by wreckage, your light longing for lightness. I'd have to be as quiet as the youths whose youth made them stupid and lovely. They are God's niggas now. Like you. I'm thinking of the stall of intoxicated cool that stalled you before it stalled them. I know men who want to die this way. Smoke like snow tattooing their bodies with narcotic holiness, the glaze of status, the faux lacquer of bliss. I'm coming at you live, frostbitten and thinking language is for losers, who cannot think our elegies are endlessly, and the words we put to them too often unheard and hurried. I'm coming at you live from the intangible. Do you want to ride or die, crowded into a small space, spitting, come with me? One day my song will be called Language is for Lovers. One day desire will not be a form of wickedness. And when you offer your drug, oh ghost, I'll resist. So again, there are all sorts of things at work. I am thinking obviously about the sort of icon that he is, Tupac Shakur is, and also the sort of damage, I guess, that comes out of his, his form of passion or his sort of sense of self. So all those things interest me. And so I don't think I write poems really even about subjects. I don't write poems about Orpheus or about Tupac Shakur or about hip hop, but more I'm really interested in sort of that point of engagement where sort of an individual self, which is me, but not always me, meets with art or meets with the subject matter. That's what's interesting to me, not the subject matter itself. So it just becomes not that relevant a lot of the time that people know the wide variety of sources that come out of the poems or go into the poems. What I love about poetry is that I think, and some people have said this is true of like a personal essay or lyric essay, and maybe it's true, but I definitely think it's true for poetry. What I love about poetry is the way it sort of is a way to watch the mind unfolding. So there's something interior about it. Like if you think of the mind as a mechanism in a glass box, when that mechanism starts clicking and turning and maybe a little ball goes rolling through it, that is how I think about, an ideal poem gives you that kind of access. And so depending on your perspective, you would say it gives you access to a soul, like the way a soul is engaging the material world. Or you might say, again, a mind, the way a mind engages, the way an intellect, the way a sensibility, all of these things are true. But that's what I love about poetry. And that's why I think it's great in its engagement of other forms, whether people are writing poems or myself about movies or about music or about, a family vacation or about a loss. It gives you that kind of access, which I really don't think happens in other forms. So I think music in its relationship to sound and its relationship to sort of instrumentation is not as interior, interestingly enough. I mean, I think that there are exceptions to that sort of rule. But generally, I don't think that it's interior. I don't think that painting, which I love, almost at the same level, the same intensity that I love music and poetry, but I don't think painting either is quite as interior. And I think it's something about the relationship to language and the access that we all have to it and the way that we sort of acquire language skills first. It's like the first thing we learn how to do. In that regard, it's why I think that language is appropriate and poetry is more appropriate for me than something like just a rap song or just a photograph or just a painting. So, but you can write about those things. It can absorb those things. It can absorb a lot of the things that one might feel engaging those forms. But again, there's something about what I think of as or what I prefer is the kind of transparency that comes with watching language sort of at work. I do think that poetry is a way for all of us, anybody again with access to language, whatever that language is, to connect with their material world. But then Dickinson talks about like a poem should take the top of your head off, which goes to the idea I think of lightheadedness too, the idea of sort of being lifted up by something. So what's interesting to me is that it's not always about the sort of production of it, because I think this isn't true. It's only true for poets, where if you meet 10 people and you tell them you write poetry, 8 of those people will say, oh, I write poems too, So in that regard, I think that's great because we all have an access to the language. But for me, and this is part of like when I think about teaching a workshop, there's an excitement about not producing it, but absorbing it, but taking in other people's forms of production, if that makes sense. So what I love about poetry is that going into other people's work or witnessing other people's work. It's not purely about making poems to engage the world. It's also about receiving other people's engagement. Again, like it's about seeing inside other people's sorts of psyches. The reason that I chose Shakur and the reason that I chose Cocktails with Orpheus, because, the Cocktail with Orpheus poem is somewhat, again, intuitive. It's a poem that, I don't even really remember writing. I think I was just messing around with a bunch of failed poems and that came out of it. And I love that. I love that sort of mysteriousness for myself, even as the person that sort of produced it, that I can't fully explain it. I could be forced to make up some theories, but not really. The Shakur poem is different. Like that poem comes out of a story that I heard when I was in Nebraska about 2 white kids who were doing meth in the wintertime, and they pulled to the side of the road and took a nap. They froze. And I started thinking about the casualness of death, the casual relationship with death that those kids had, and the casual relationship with death that not just Tupac Shakur, but also Biggie Smalls, the way they courted it through their music. So for me, that's a very different sort of impetus and a different sort of reason for writing the poem. But they get to the same place, the idea that to say pimping wreckage or to be light, longing for lightness, like that idea that there's something to me, and I think this is probably just my own sensibility, but there's something that makes a lot of sense to me in the way that Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls are really having conversations, not with the guys who are rappers, not with the guys who are trying to sort of compete with them, which would be true for someone like Jay-Z, who I like. There's a different kind of like otherworldliness to when I hear a lot of Tupac songs and Biggie Smalls too. Like Biggie Smalls' music is almost nihilistic, So there's something more real to me, even though it's darker and you might say gothic and sadder, but there's something more human in the way that they seem to be courting this kind of like mortality, even if there was something romantic to it, if that makes sense. So that's what I was really going after in that, trying to think about like that kind of desire is really, obviously it's short-lived, and that's why neither one of them are here. But to me as a subject, that becomes as interesting as, again, like the myth of Orpheus losing his beloved in the underworld. But they, again, they're just regular, very common figures in our culture, but it's that idea around them. Like that's what I think about when I think about them. I don't think about, the music's great, which it is, but there's something up underneath it that compels me to sort of feel like they're worthy of a poem, or I can, sustain a poem about them.